of the national interest. And today, we are here to discuss Russia, America, and NATO. Where is our alliance headed with Europe, and how do our relations with Russia impact that? As you know, President Trump, as is his wont, has created considerable controversy during his visit to Brussels, prompting speculation everywhere from that he was doing exactly the right thing from some of his supporters by prodding the alliance members to increase their payments to NATO, to speculation that he wasn't really interested in the payments and it was simply a pretext to begin the destruction of America's membership in NATO. Now, today, to discuss where we are headed, we have three distinguished speakers. We'll begin with Ambassador Richard Burt, who was Assistant Secretary of State for European and Canadian Affairs during the Reagan administration, also Ambassador to Germany, and now Managing Partner at Clardy Associates. He will be followed by Dimitri K, who is the President and CEO of the Center, as many of you know. And then we will turn for some comments to Ambassador Kurt Volker, who is the Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, and was previously Ambassador to NATO and the Executive Director of the McCain Institute in Arizona. Rick, I'll leave it to you to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jacob. And I think I have to begin by stating the obvious. You called me several weeks ago asking whether I would be willing to participate in this luncheon seminar. And I agreed, but I never knew that it would be on the heels of Donald Trump's diplomatic triumph in Brussels, which we heard the President outline at his press conference this morning. And I'm sort of here under sort of false pretenses because I was prepared for a slightly different discussion, not just because of the fact that we were doing this following the NATO summit, but and it was indeed a special and unique NATO summit. But also, I was prepared to talk a little bit more about alliances and the value to U.S. Foreign security policy and the kind of triangular issue that is raised by this topic. So I'm going to do both. I'll be brief. But I would just like to make a few statements about alliances because it's not simply NATO that sort of is under debate and discussion in foreign policy circles today, but also other security relationships the United States currently has and developed in the post-World War II era. And I guess very quickly, I should put it on the table, I am pro-alliance. I think they've done more good than harm to the United States in the last 50 years or so. And at the same time, there are some risks and costs with alliances, and some of them actually go directly to this triangular or trilateral relationship between the United States, NATO, and Russia, so I'll get into that as well. But let me first of all begin what I would call the pros of alliances, and in particular of NATO. I think alliances tend to expand and extend U.S. power and authority globally. It's certainly been the case with NATO, which has not only expanded our power geopolitically, not only into the western part of Eurasia, but beyond Eurasia in the Middle East and beyond. Alliances also, if different with the right countries, give us some potential niche capabilities that we wouldn't otherwise have. And I mean this both in terms of knowledge, but experience. And probably the best example of that is the relationship we had for years with France, which has capabilities and the ability to intervene in places like French West Africa, where basically we don't know really what we're doing, and because of that, it's a useful add-on to our overall menu of capabilities. Alliances also, I think, when you're the top dog in a relationship, provide often unspoken dividends. And by that I'm being polite. When you're the United States in an alliance, you expect your allies, by and large, to pay very close attention to what you're saying and doing. And you're often expected to support the top dog, whether it's votes in the UN, regional tribunals. But there's a degree where leadership has its benefits, and I think alliances are an example of that. Allies, as I was suggesting, can be a good source of intelligence, but also sometimes they can be a very good source of judgment if we are prepared to pay attention to our allies. We saw examples of that. Probably the most famous one in recent years was the fact that both Germany and France thought that our invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a major mistake. We ignored that advice to our detriment. But there are allies that have experience and skills that we can take advantage of. And I'll make the last point, is I have the view that alliances can be especially important, and I think this goes to the core of the NATO relationship, especially important when you can combine shared interests with shared values. I don't want to get into a debate between the liberal internationalists and the neocons and the realists over what is more important, the value aspect or the interest aspect. But when both are in alignment, it can be very powerful. And I might point out, in contrast to maybe the president, that one very important example of that throughout the Cold War, and I would say on many occasions after the Cold War, is the U.S.-German relationship. There you have had, since really the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Constitution, which was largely reflected American political values, and still does, an alignment of strategic interests and of political values that has created the ability to not only cooperate, but to create trust in the alliance, which is important. And even, this is not a sort of realpolitik term, but a degree of affection, which is important. Now there are cons, and very quickly, alliances need to have a contemporary rationale. They can't be zombies, and there have been times when some of our important alliances, for one reason or another, lost rationale, and as a result, it did stagnate. I think for a period of time in the 1990s, that was true of NATO. There was actually think tanks around town, especially at the Atlantic Council. When I would go to meetings there once during the Clinton administration, people were really bending over backwards to figure out what NATO should do. The Soviet threat had evaporated. The Russian Federation was in disarray. And that's when you can make mistakes. And I would argue that one of the problems that has led to our relationship today with Russia was that NATO expansion sort of became an end in itself. It became not a kind of necessarily it didn't have a strategic rationale as much as it had a democracy promotion rationale. bring these countries into NATO. They will become member democracies. They will become parts of the West. And we didn't think about this process in retrospect, strategically enough. And that was a mistake. And you can all differ where you would have drawn the line, whether you would have drawn the line in the Visegrad states or where we should have stopped. But when, in my judgment, George W. Bush went to Bucharest in 2007, proposed the inclusion of Ukraine and Georgia, that was a bridge too far. And I think we've been living with the consequences since then. And I told my colleague Fran just a few minutes ago that I was sort of somewhat confused to see both the Georgian leader and Poroshenko show up at the NATO summit yesterday, because I'm sure Putin and his cohorts in the Kremlin were just delighted to see that event in Brussels. So NATO does, I think, have a contemporary rationale once again, which is another good reason for us to reconsider our commitment to Afghanistan. It's not the key issue any longer for NATO. Deterring and defending against Russian revanchism is. Another con, of course, and I won't go into any detail here because Donald Trump has developed this issue extensively, and that is the free rider problem. It appears to me, though, that we are coming to grips with that issue. Finally, I would just simply say there's a lobbying problem made up of allies. Once we have allies, as Vic Brzezinski said many years ago, that Washington has become a bazaar. All of these countries want to influence our politics, and so they all establish lobbies in that. And that often does not lead to most coherent decision making. But finally, on the triangular point that I'm sure Dimitri will develop, and that is this. There are some paradoxes here, because there is the view that, and it's promoted clearly by the Russians themselves, that a strong NATO makes the West dangerous. A strong alliance, cohesive alliance, is a threat to the Russian Federation. But the fact is probably just the reverse. I think for Putin to take the West seriously, to take the United States seriously, you need a strong, cohesive NATO. And this goes back to, if you will, the essence of what the West worked out as a strategy in the late 1960s. It was embodied in the famous Armel report, and the sort of two-track doctrine of defense and détente. So anybody who is interested, it would seem to me, in developing a constructive relationship with this current Russian regime would want the strongest possible relationship with NATO, and to have the strongest possible relationship with Germany. Whether you like it or not, Germany is not only the strongest, the most important country in Europe, but it's the strategic linchpin of Europe, and we just need to look at the history of the 20th century to know that when the United States gets on the wrong side of issues with Germany, the results are pretty bad. So we have a tremendous strategic incentive to make a strong U.S.-German relationship and a strong U.S.-European relationship a key to developing a constructive set of relationships with Russia. Now, does that mean that Russia will never be part of the West? I can't answer that question. I think you have to look past Putin to get an answer to that question. I don't think that Putin has any interest in joining the West. I think he has made it very clear that he feels, rightly or wrongly, feels that he's being betrayed by the West. The West shouldn't follow through on commitments and promises that were made, and that the West is an adversary. In that type of situation, a situation where there is no trust, maybe we can begin building it, but the only circumstances that we should build that trust balanced as a strong NATO alliance. NATO, in my view, is not an impediment to working with the Russians. It's a precondition, and I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Rick, for those characteristically lucid remarks. Now we'll turn to Dimitri, who I should mention has a lengthy analysis of President Trump's foreign policy in the new issue of the national interest called Poised for Success with a question mark. So I'll turn to Dimitri now.
Thank you for publishing the article.
Before Dimitri starts, can I ask, did you insist on the question mark?
No, actually,
I did.
I'm not sure I should tell the truth.
I did. No. I agree with Ambassador Burt that NATO is essential to an effective pursuit of U.S. national interests. With all its imperfections, NATO is a key component of American power. And to give up this component would be reckless, particularly when there's no overriding need to do so. I also think that as we're trying to change relationship with China, as we already have an adversarial relationship with Russia, and I agree with Ambassador Burt again, that reasonable people of goodwill can have different views of how we arrived at our current relationship with Moscow. But I think very clearly today this relationship is dominated by adversity. It is a fact of life, and I think it would be kind of reckless to awaken the Russian bear, but then not to be prepared to deal with its anger and its desire to reestablish its power and respect on the world arena. For all of that, I think having reliable allies, powerful allies, is essential in terms of American national interests. Having said that, NATO is a very dangerous alliance in terms of American vital interests. Alliances, obviously, can greatly enhance your power and credibility. But they also, unless we are very careful and analytical, they provoke wars. Go back to the Peloponnesian War. That's how that war have started. And you may remember how, according to the historians, the Athenian allies were explaining the way their great alliance have started. No, they did not twist anybody's arms. They did not force anybody to join the alliance. Small Greek states were coming to them and asking for protection because the Athenians, they were victorious against the Persian Empire. They had, if you wish, credentials in terms of both ruthless effectiveness and moral superiority. And they were certainly the most progressive state in Greece. And yet, when the alliance became too big, too powerful, when they began taking as allies countries which had their own agendas and whose own commitment to Greek values, I don't want to say European values, Greek values at that time, relatively progressive by the standards of that period, when they began taking states which did not quite belong there, but were coming because they wanted to be more effective in dealing with their own plans, which very often had nothing to do with the Athenian own agenda. Well, you go to war. And that war lasted for decades. It was brutal. The Athenians have lost, and moreover, the whole Greece have lost. It never was able quite to recover its place in the Mediterranean geopolitics. I think that we have to understand what happened to the NATO alliance. As I was preparing for my presentation today, I looked at my very small archive and found my correspondence with George Kennan, who wrote to me criticizing my support in mid-1990s of inviting Visegrad nations to join NATO. I was one of few Russian specialists who were in favor of that limited NATO enlargement, because I thought, as Ambassador Burt again said, it was morally right. These were democratic states. These were states that clearly belonged to the European civilization. And moreover, they did not have common borders with Russia, with an exception, notable exception of Poland having common borders with a small Kaliningrad enclave. I thought that it was relatively safe. Not so, Ambassador Kern wrote to me. He said that I did not quite understand how the American political process worked, that he himself did not always understand it when he proceeded with his containment theory, and he thought that it could be done in a very refined and calibrated fashion. No, he said, if you get on this enlargement train, there would be a blind momentum of NATO expansion. And the way our public opinion works, Congress works, we would not be able to resist. And very often, as again, as Ambassador Burt have said, NATO enlargement would become an end in itself. And the process, of course, the NATO mission has changed dramatically. It used to be protection of what clearly were vital American interests in defending Western Europe, in protecting Germany, particularly Berlin. It would be very easy to make a legitimate, in my view, a non-controversial case, why NATO at that time was doing what the United States, in terms of American foreign policy interests, needed most. Now, we brought many nations in the alliance who contribute very little to mutual defense, who have their own historic grievances with Russia, who pursue their own parochial agendas, and who I don't want to offend anyone who by any objective criteria should not be even in NATO. Because if you would look, for instance, at Latvia and Estonia, they have started their existence as new sovereign nations by essentially making about 30% in the Estonian case and 40% in the Latvian case of their citizens, non-citizens, those of Russian background, because they made a decision that anyone who was not born in pre-war independent Latvia and Estonia, or did not have origins in those states, that they would lose not just their voting rights, but rights to be a part of any public service, or even getting any public contracts and teaching in public schools. They would have to go through a long process of assimilations, learning language, and a kind of proving their loyalty to new states. It's very difficult for me to imagine that we would allow millions of Mexican Americans to become that kind of second-class citizens after they were already citizens. And of course, we allow Spanish to become a second language in many respects in the United States, where Latvia and Estonia were suppressing the rights of Russian language. It's not just morally wrong, it was politically very significant, because as a result, Latvia and Estonia became bitterly divided countries, very vulnerable, and ruled by populations which had very strong historical grievances against Russia. They had very legitimate grievances, very legitimate, because the Soviet Union have treated them terribly when they were invaded by Stalin, when hundreds of thousands of their citizens were exiled and died in concentration camps. It's very difficult not to identify with their suffering and not to have great respect for their courage and perseverance. Nevertheless, their agendas were not European agendas, and they certainly were not something that can be considered an essential American foreign policy priority. And as NATO alliance was moving closer and closer, as Robert Gates put it, to the suburbs of St. Petersburg, we inevitably began getting attention of Russian military planners, which was absolutely predictable. It was perfectly predictable that they would have a different view of what NATO was doing in terms of our military preparations, and that they would start to respond. Now, Russian responses don't make sense if you look at what the West really has in mind. And clearly, we are very careful not to do things anywhere close to Russian borders, which would be unduly provocative and would represent an immediate threat to Russia. But I only can tell you that if Russia would organize regular military exercises in Canada and in Mexico, even if this would be rotating exercises, and even if certainly whatever Russia would put there would not be a match for US military forces, I don't need to tell you what the reaction in the United States would be. I think that President Trump is absolutely right in two respects. First, we have to look very carefully at NATO mission. It should be focused on the protection of what really are essential American national interests. And because we made a commitment now to Baltic states, I think that American commitment should be considered sacrosanct, and we most certainly should be guaranteeing their security. And to do less, incidentally, would be provocative and could invite Russian aggression, which most definitely would not be in the American interest. But I think that we also have to be making clear to these countries that Article 5 is not a mandate for provocative behavior vis-a-vis Russia. That we would defend them in a case of unprovoked aggression, but otherwise they should accept greater responsibility for their own defense. And yes, I should say, for their own prudent behavior. I think that if you look at European, EU, and US GNP, if you look at level of our defense expenditure, it's very difficult not to agree with the President that the Europeans can and should do more. I also think that this is very prudent politically, because it's one thing, let's say, for the Norwegians to invite greater US military presence if it doesn't involve any real effort on their part. And it would be a different kind of a decision if we know that they would have to contribute to protecting their security. Then I think it gives you a greater sense of reality, of what is really necessary and what cost you are prepared to pay. Now, Helsinki. I think that the Russians are coming to Helsinki confused, hopeful, and apprehensive. Why they are confused? I think they are confused because all of us are confused about what is the US foreign policy at the moment and what the Trump administration is really planning to do. I think they are hopeful, not because they think that Trump is the agent or they can control him or that they can manipulate him, but they are hopeful because they think, and now I will sound like the Washington Post or a Washington Post editorial, because they think that Trump maybe, just maybe, thinks the way they do. Not in terms of being soft on Russia, but in terms of defining US national interests in a more narrow, realpolitik fashion. They do understand that he wants to make America stronger, and an increase in US defense spending and NATO spending is obviously not what they like. But you know, as a concept, they understand that. If we're adversaries, quite logically, the United States wants to come to negotiate from a position of strength. They certainly don't like that Trump wants to kill Nord Stream 2, which they consider essential to their energy security, but more important, they think Trump is very right here, to their leverage over Europe and to their political influence in Europe. Again, they understand that we are adversaries, and it is perfectly logical for the United States to be opposed to a project like that. What they have a big problem with people on both sides of the Atlantic who, in their view, would not want to deal with Russia and to reach any agreement with Russia, almost no matter what. They understand if, as I believe Ambassador Kurt is making a valiant effort to do, we want to return Eastern Ukraine to Kiev control. They may not agree with all our conditions and proposals, but they don't understand why we would want that. What they don't understand is when they get an impression that they would return Eastern Ukraine, that they would make major concessions in Syria, that they would distance themselves from Iran, and after that they would be told, well, you have displayed flexibility, but the motive behind this flexibility is weakness. Our policy of strength is working, so instead of having any kind of accommodation, we should put more pressure on you. That doesn't give them any light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that, again, we're entitled to pursue this policy because we think that they're bad guys and they deserve this kind of treatment. And let me say, they're bad guys and they deserve that kind of treatment. And I can make a long case why they deserve that kind of treatment. And can you give me a longer list of the imperfections that you would even find in the mainstream media? The point is, what do we want to get as a result of that policy? If we want to make them feel bad, we can accomplish that. If we want to retard somewhat their economic development, we can accomplish that. But, first of all, it would very unlikely change their fundamental foreign policy behavior. And second, it would come possibly, I would even say probably, at the cost of them increasingly viewing geopolitics a kind of through the prism of outright hostility to the United States, and being prepared to offer a helping hand to all American enemies, and whenever possible, building a closer relationship with China directed against the United States. That used to be a nightmare of the US foreign policy for decades. A close relationship between Beijing and Moscow directed against the United States. Now, obviously, Russia is not what the Soviet Union used to be, but China also is not what China used to be. The dynamics between these two countries would be very different than before, but it's still, if they become too close, could be detrimental to the United States. And there are many other areas where they can create problems to America. Accordingly, I am kind of in favor of Trumpian approach. Not always of Trumpian rhetoric, not always of what I think his recklessness and his willingness to break China when this China, is, to use his language, is beautiful and is working well. But I do think that we should explore a possible opening with Moscow in order to seek a more normal relationship. I think that Putin is coming to Helsinki in a weak position. He has an economic program at this point which is ambitious but totally unrealistic without new foreign investment. They refuse to negotiate about sanctions because they claim it's not the issue, they're too proud to do it, things that Paul heard it from senior Russian officials when we were there together. But we do know better. They do want to leave from sanctions. More important, they want a better climate for foreign investment. If we are prepared to give them a modicum of hope, I think we can deal with these issues. I think that Kurt has a real potential to negotiate a deal on Eastern Ukraine. If we kind of find a formula for Ukraine staying out of NATO for a while, reliably, but without necessarily legal guarantees. I understand it's not easy. I actually understand why it is very difficult in terms of domestic politics in both countries and of course in Europe. But I do think that we are in a situation when with determination, demonstration of force, but also a kind of practical flexibility, we have an opportunity to do something important. Not necessarily, of course, in terms of any specific agreement in Helsinki, but starting an important process which would be in the U.S. interest.
Thank you, Dimitri. We'll now turn for some comments from Kurt.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me start off with a disclaimer that while it is true that I am serving as a U.S. representative for Ukraine negotiations, I am here in my capacity as a former ambassador to NATO and as executive director of the McCain Institute, and therefore not making any policy pronouncements or speaking on behalf of the administration at all. Second, let me organize some comments this way. Let me talk first about how I see what's happening this week with the NATO meetings and the Helsinki meeting and so forth. Then maybe backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit more about the world that we're in and NATO and also NATO enlargement. As far as what's happening this week, take these basic actions and policy premises. Complaining about our West European allies, principally low levels of defense spending, committing to NATO as an organization and reinforcing Article 5 and U.S. goals, positioning to have a position of strength in dealing with Russia and some of its very nefarious activities of invading and occupying neighboring countries, taking their territory, attacking U.S. forces in Syria, the strong military and nuclear capacities, which we see as in violation of INF, for example. So taking a very strong stand against those. And seeking to meet with and work with the Russian leadership to see where we can agree and do things together and where we're going to disagree. That kind of describes U.S. policy under each of the last 7 presidents. It's not shocking that this is what President Trump is doing. It's what President Obama did. It's what President Bush did. It's what President Clinton did, and so on. So what we are easily distracted by is the tone, the style, the performance, the rhetoric, the drama in the way President Trump is going about things. But when you look at sort of how this is playing out, this is a familiar set of policies. I would be, for instance, very surprised if something came out of the Helsinki meeting that was actually a major move in U.S. policy, recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea or distancing from their aspirations to be part of Europe or things like that. I'd be very, very surprised if that's the case. I think what my guess is that the president wants to have what he sees as a good meeting. He wants to have a discussion. He wants to have a lot of issues on the table. He wants to see where there might be room where we could do something together, where we both agree. But I don't see any gain for him personally in, say, something like recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea. In fact, it would probably be very damaging to him to do so. And on the contrary, not doing so allows him to continue to say, see, it's all just a witch hunt, which I think he would very much want to say. So I don't think we should get too far off thinking that there's something different going on here. Then into the wider realm of things, I think we're still grappling with Russia's collapse of empire and desire to restore empire. And it's a difficult and volatile thing. But I think first off, it was Putin, when he first came into office, and Russia was a mess, that he made clear his priority was law and order and rebuilding the greatness of Russia. And he said the collapse of the former Soviet Union was one of the great tragedies, or the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and set out to restore Russian strength. He had his Khrushchev moment of banging the shoe on the table, equivalent of that at least, at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, which was well before the Bucharest summit, where Ukraine and Georgia were discussed as they would be on track for NATO membership or not. It was after the other rounds of NATO enlargement, and I firmly believe that NATO enlargement has been a very good thing for all the right strategic rationales from the beginning. I think enlarging to include Germany was a good idea. I think enlarging to include Greece and Turkey was a good idea. I think bringing in Central and East European countries was a good idea. I don't think it is fair or appropriate way to talk about, say, Latvia or Lithuania as countries with grievances against Russia. These are countries that are afraid of Russia because Russia took them over and occupied them and deported their leadership and sent people to Siberia for decades. And what they most desperately want is for that not to happen again. And the whole purpose of NATO from the founding was to find security in collective defense, that an attack on one would be an attack on all, so an attack doesn't happen. And that was actually a very successful policy, and I think we created NATO at a time when such attacks were quite possible. We were very concerned about Berlin. We were very concerned about Germany. We were concerned about Russian efforts to flip the government in Italy. We were concerned about what they had done in Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia. So it was a creation of a military alliance at a time of very high concern and tension in order to prevent things from happening, and it was rather successful. And that's exactly where NATO enlargement falls in security terms, with Baltic states, with Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, and so on, is helping those countries establish a base of security so that those sorts of things that happened to them in the past don't happen again, and we can have stability in Europe. Where we got to after that is Russia concluding under Putin that this is an unfair arrangement in the post-Cold War, and it's going to try to reverse it. And particularly to draw a line with Ukraine and Georgia. And so it changed the terms. It has invaded both countries. It has occupied territory in both countries. It has claimed to annex Crimea. It still has forces in Moldova. And it is a demonstration of why this policy of NATO, strong NATO and NATO enlargement was so important. Because at least those countries that have made it into the alliance are not facing the same things. We probably have much better policies on, say, treatment of Russian minorities in the Baltic states now than we would have had they not joined NATO. They could very well be occupied again, but if not, I think they'd be much more fearful. The problem in Estonia now, and I've looked into this because I wanted to find examples for how Ukraine is dealing with language issues in schools. The problem with Estonia is they don't have enough Estonian teachers to teach the Russian community that wants to learn Estonian. They have every right, and they do in fact speak Russian and study in Russian and are quite happy not to be part of Russia. They want to learn Estonian, and there isn't enough capacity in Estonia to deliver it fast enough. And so they're actually concerned in the government of Estonia that they're not enfranchising the population as quickly as they like to, and as quickly as the population would like to. When it comes to going forward, I think that what we need is to get beyond the imperial mindset that Russia has a say over its neighbors. Dimitri is the example of military exercises close to our borders. Russia conducts military exercises and in fact has a permanent military presence inside the borders of its neighbors, which they don't want. So I think we have to get beyond an imperial mindset where Russia feels that it has a right to do that, and instead find both a stability in the security relationships that we're not at risk of conflict, and at the same time Russia be able to live with and respect its neighbors and their own sovereign decisions over the way they govern their countries. Some of the issues that countries need to grapple with still need to be grappled with, and respect for minority rights is a good example, but you can add others as well, and you can talk about corruption, and you can talk about good governance, and you can talk about trade, and there's a lot of things that should be improved. But I think the fundamental starting point has to be getting back to our Helsinki principles, which the Soviet Union, when it was powerful, agreed to. And that includes a respect for the sovereignty and the sovereign decisions of other countries, a respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, a refraining from the threat or use of force to change borders, and so on. And I think that we don't have that mindset in Russia today, but I'm actually more optimistic now than I was a few years ago. I think there are signs in Russia that patience with the militant nationalist approach of Putin is wearing thin, and it can't continue the way it is continuing now indefinitely. So I think we will see some change, and I think that will bring about a time when we can actually stabilize things again.
Well, that was a very optimistic, and I guess for some people even soothing presentation of the state of American relations with Europe. I'm just going to kick off the questions with one of my own, which is, are we being too cautious here? Despite what Kurt has said, if you look at Trump's rhetoric over the past weeks, does it not imply that President Trump has a very different conception of world order in mind? One in which the United States does, in fact, operate on a realist outlook of the world, which is that it would not, in fact, have these entangling alliances with Europe or anywhere else, that it would act as a unilateral power, which I might note, Irving Kristol, the original publisher of the National Interest, was in fact opposed to American membership in NATO from at least the 1960s on, maybe even in the 1950s, because he thought that the United States should simply act as an independent power and not be constrained by its alliances. He in fact saw NATO as inhibiting American military action around the world because we had to take the concerns of our allies into account. And he got into furious arguments with Sir Michael Howard in the 1980s over this. There have been debates. George Kennan was originally opposed to the creation of NATO, delivered lectures, I think in 1958 on the BBC, calling for a united and neutral Germany. Walter Lippmann, we've had a lot of, both on the left and the right, a lot of intellectuals at least, who have been very skeptical of America's role in NATO. Now, the dominant opinion is that NATO has been a good thing. But does President Trump, in fact, reflect a pre-World War II Republican tradition, which is stronger than the internationalist Republican tradition that we saw in the Cold War? Was the Cold War the anomaly in American foreign policy? And does President Trump intend to sever America's relations with NATO, pull out of the World Trade Organization, essentially upend everything that emerged in the immediate post-war era? I'd just be curious to hear what the panelists think about that. Dimitri?
Well, I think that if you look at the American tradition, we probably should start with the number one founding father, George Washington. And George Washington, in his farewell address, he talked about the fundamental danger for the United States to become too much involved in European disputes and warned the Americans about the danger of European entanglements. And that school of thought was always quite strong, not only in the Republican Party, but in American politics. And I think that the Cold War was in a way an exception, and obviously it came in the aftermath of World War II, when there was an apocalyptic threat, when there was a clear confrontation between good and evil, and evil was entirely evil, good was not entirely good, but nonetheless there was a fundamental moral difference between the two sides. What we are witnessing today, I think, is very different. And I want to be clear in responding to Ambassador Volker. I do think that Article 5 should be considered sacrosanct. It's not a question of what was wise at the time when certain nations were invited to join NATO. I think the question is what responsibilities we have today. And I feel that a starting assumption in our negotiation with Russia is that Article 5 is Article 5, which is not to say that our commitment to Article 5 should preclude us from having a meaningful dialogue with our European allies about their responsibilities and what is wise, particularly for small Russian neighbors, in terms of their dialogue with the Russians. Completely agree with Ambassador Volker that the Balts are really afraid of Russia. And I would go further, they are legitimately afraid. My problem is that I think that today they are more entitled to be afraid than they were 10 years ago. Because if you would look at DoD military studies, Center for Naval Analysis, Rand Corporation military studies, you can see that before NATO enlargement, and particularly before 2014, the Russians were doing very little in terms of military preparations in the Baltic area. And then there was a fairly dramatic increase. Now, you can make a case that it was a legitimate response on the Russian part to our legitimate concern of what they have done in Ukraine. That doesn't, however, change the fact that Russian military preparations put the Balts in a greater danger. Some of us around this table were at a meeting with Bob Gates when he was Secretary of Defense in the George W. Bush administration. And some of us around the table were shocked when he said that the United States did not have contingency plans to defend Baltic states at the time. Well, now, again, Kurt, you know the things much better than I do, so you can correct me, but I understand that there are contingency plans. And that's an important and commendable step forward. But let me say that from everything I know, there are no good contingency plans in terms of what it would mean for local populations. So in my mind, it's not a debate between those who want to allow Russia to get away with murder and those who want to be virtuous and tough. I think that we need to have a serious conversation about where we are now, to analyze not only our options, but also unintended consequences of our choices. And I think that we should operate on the assumption that Putin wants his research in Russia to reestablish elements of the Russian Empire. I think that we also think that Kurt and I at least would agree that he is not prepared to go any place and to pay any price, that he is too pragmatic for that. So the question is, how do we structure our dialogue with Russia? How do we have a combination of flexibility and strength? And one thing that I hope we will not do, we will stop this nonsense about every time there is an indication of willingness to talk to Moscow seriously, we will not say every time, well, that's what Putin wants. Well, Putin wants the mankind to survive. Perhaps it's also in our interest. Putin clearly does not like Islamic extremist terrorism. Perhaps fighting against this kind of people is in our interest. Putin clearly is aware of Chinese potential to become a strategic menace to Russia. I think it's in our interest for him to be aware of this danger. I think the question for us should not be what benefits Putin. The question for us should be what benefits the United States of America and how we can accomplish our objectives at a reasonable cost and in a reliable way. that used to be called foreign policy realism. And I think that Trump is an intuitive foreign policy realist. I also think that because of his previous life and his background and his temper, as Kurt hinted, well, he doesn't always talk like one in a very analytical and structured way. And it's very easy to criticize him, almost as easy as it is to criticize Putin. But I think that we should look at both sides of his political personality, and we should give him credit when he's trying to accomplish things that are really important, while pointing out dangers of throwing the baby with the water.
Rick?
Well, now the question really is what does Trump want? And I think you ask a splendid question, and key to your question were the numerous serious people who have thought about a very alternative track in the foreign policy over the last 60 or 70 years. Essentially, should the United States go alone as a global superpower and unilaterals? And does Trump fit into that group? I think, talking about Donald Trump as a foreign policy strategist is I think, an enormous mistake. I don't think actually that Trump spent a lot of time in his life thinking about foreign policy. I don't think he's spent too much time as president thinking about foreign policy. I guess I would begin with the answer to the question is that Trump, in my judgment, mainly thinks of himself as an entertainer. And he likes narratives. He likes stories that he can tell that will be appreciated by his audience. And in his view, his audience is his populist base. So what we've seen at the NATO summit, what the narrative there was, these feckless Europeans are not doing enough for defense. They're taking us for a ride. And oh, by the way, they're cheating us with trade and other things. So I'm going to show my audience that I'm going to go to Brussels, I'm going to pound the table, and by the end of that summit, there will be a triumphant success story to tell. And that's what he did this morning. He said he generated at least $33 billion more for defense spending. That's the end of the Trump show for now, and the next installment will be in Helsinki. So that's Donald Trump in a nutshell, and it was similar to what he did in Singapore. The real question is what's the cumulative impact of this? I don't think it is conscious uprooting or restructuring of the international order, because that you require strategy for that. You need a vision of an alternative international order and a way to get and a strategy for doing it. And he's not capable of doing it. And I don't think the people, for the most part, around him are capable of helping him. The real danger here, so it isn't that, or the real opportunity, whether you think it's an opportunity or danger, isn't that the Trump administration is going to pursue a brand new strategy, vision and strategy. It is that his approach to the presidency, this churn of narratives, will have a lot of unintended consequences. And here I kind of disagree with my friend Kurt Volker. He was saying that, in a sense, with what Trump's been saying and doing, it's not so different. Well, at least the result, the substance is not so different than the last 7 administrations, I think he said, and he's probably right. But, in other words, you were saying, with Trump that we focus too much on the form, not the substance. But the problem, in my view, is the form can kill you in the long run. Because in my view, that whole NATO summit story that may appeal to his base did, at the same time, did an enormous amount of damage with our allies. I think that based on the feedback and what I've seen, I think that a lot of them are, some of them are in shock, some of them are dismayed, some of them are disgusted. And the problem is if this continues, it's going to create the potential for destroying the system without any replacement, without any alternative measure. And that's what I worry about.
We'll go to disagreement is good. Let's go to a quick comment from Kurt, and then I promise you we'll have questions.
Well, I actually agree with Rick. I was trying to lay out the case on substance, but I agree with the collateral damage point that you're making. And in fact, I was just in Berlin last week, and that's all you heard was collateral damage. So no, that's a very fair point. I think we'll get through it all, but that's real. To your question, Jacob, I thought it was interesting. I think if you think about 1930s and prior Republican policy, I think we're dealing with paradigms, and you know, it's always a great trick of political science is to create categories and then take shots at those categories as to why they don't apply. But I think the category that refers to is isolationism or neo-isolationism. I don't see Trump as an isolationist at all. I think he's actually very actively engaged internationally trying to do things. He's also not a neocon or a neoliberal interventionist. That's not where he's coming from either. I do think it's his defining characteristic, Rick gave a good example and articulated well being a showman. I would also just say as a businessman, or someone who thinks of himself as a businessman, I think he looks at issues in the framework of costs and opportunities. And he'll look at certain relationships we have now, like our alliance, so there's a lot of costs. So we're paying a lot, we're doing a lot, we need a fair deal. So it's all about fairness. Where are there opportunities? It's where things are a mess. And that's where you can find something to create and say, okay, let's do this. So I think he looks at North Korea and Russia as opportunities and doesn't want to create his own limitations about how to pursue those. So let's see what he can do. And meanwhile, clamor for a fair deal, you know, where there are costs that are high. That's, you know, it's neither isolationism nor traditional internationalism. It's something else. But it doesn't, as Rick said, it doesn't change the structure of U.S. vision.
Well, I'm going to go bursting with questions. So who wants to? John Evans. Can you please announce yourself on the point?
Yes, John Evans, formerly Foreign Service. And I know some of you know this already. I knew Mr. Putin in St. Petersburg. And that's basically where I find myself differing from so many other people around this table and in this town. From my experience with that man, Mr. Putin, in St. Petersburg, when I was Consul General there was not an anti-Western bone in his body. He was, if anything, pro-German. Of course, we know his German is superb, and so he's sweet on the Germans, but he was not anti-American in any sense. He is not a communist in any sense. And Kurt, I have to stop you on this widely quoted statement attributed to Putin, and it's true that he did say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest calamity of our time, but he had a much bigger picture in his own mind of what had collapsed. We viewed, and in retrospect still view, the Soviet Union as our great enemy during the Cold War. The Soviet Union, for people who lived there, was something much more. It was security, it was a very bad but still workable safety net. And remember what General Levitt said. General Levitt said, and only half of it ever gets quoted, he said, and a lot of Americans find this hard to say, to understand. He said, he who doesn't regret the passing of the Soviet Union has no heart. But he who thinks it can be reestablished has no brain. And that part, that doesn't get quoted. Everybody was quoting that after Levitt said it. And Putin has said it himself. And so when we jump to this conclusion, as Hillary Clinton did, very inadvisedly, of saying that Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet Union, she was wrong, and we continue to be wrong. There are 5 disputed borders in the Soviet Union right now, not just Ukraine. There's Nagorno-Karabakh, there are 2 in Georgia, there's Transnistria, and there's Ukraine in 2 very different aspects with Korea and Donbass. Now, we have taken a very legalistic approach, and we've focused primarily on Ukraine. You know, we'd like to see the others fixed as well, but this is a post-imperial situation. All of those conflicts arose because of local problems. They were not masterminded in the Kremlin. When you say that Russia has put troops in Moldova, it's not true. They were there when the conflict between the Moldovans and the left bank of the Dniester River started, and Lebed, who was there at the time, stopped the conflict. So this is, you know, Gerard Toll of this city has written a book about trying to develop a thick, deep understanding of these problems, and not simply looking at a map and applying sort of legal standards. These problems go way back. They are not easy to solve. And I think despite, I'm all for the Helsinki principles. I worked in the OSCE for a long time. But I know, for example, that in Transnistria, when it's not that simple. There are real problems there. That one, fortunately, is on the way to getting solved. Karabakh is a huge problem, not anywhere close to being solved. I won't speak about the others. But we've got to, I think, have a little bit more understanding of what is really happening there. Putin was very helpful to us with the northern route to Afghanistan. He closed the base in Cuba. He closed Kamran Bay. He really wanted to work with us for the longest time. But in 2007, you're right, at Munich, he was getting to his limit. If you go back and pull out what he said in Munich, I don't think it's that crazy. So let me just plead here. I'm all for the NATO alliance. I think it's great. I think it has to think a little bit more about what its mission is, and we've talked about that today, and see if we can stop just threatening Russia and find ways to you know, at least respect their interests. I'm sorry, that's not a question.
Well, sort of. Kurt, do you want to respond?
No, it's all right.
Can I just say one brief thing? I don't have a lot to add to the element, the Russian element, other than to say, I think Kurt and I were both at the Munich conference. I remember that speech very, very clearly. But what struck me was I hoped that speech would trigger a thoughtful debate in Washington about where we were going in our policy with Russia. But it didn't. And what was interesting, in my view, it was misinterpreted in Washington. I remember it was interpreted by a lot of people in Washington as Putin calling for a new Cold War. And Bob Gates has been referenced here. Bob Gates actually the next day in that conference said, the first thing he said before he made his remarks is, I just want everybody to understand I don't want a new Cold War. So it was really viewed as Putin throwing down the gauntlet, and not Putin, I interpreted as almost a kind of cry for help. Things are off course here. We need to get things back on course, or there's going to be real trouble.
Yeah, let me make a brief comment. And, I greatly admire John Evans. I met Putin on several occasions, but I do not know him well, and I certainly did not know him during his St. Petersburg period. My view of Russia today is somewhat less benign. And I think that their attitude has evolved. It's very true that a lot of Russians in the early 1990s, including people in the Russian establishment, were very pro-Western, I would say very pro-American. It's history now. And we have to deal with the situation the way it is. It's not a very pretty picture. My problem with our current policy toward Russia is that the American and European view of Russia is far too benign. I really mean it. We have North Korea with a very limited nuclear capability, uncertain nuclear capability, and we are very concerned about what they can do to the United States, to American forces in the Pacific, to our allies. And here you have a major Russian nuclear modernization. You can see how they are consolidating their defense establishment and are putting people who are known for their ruthless effectiveness, like Dmitri Rogozin, in charge of it. There is a very serious modernization of Russian strategic nuclear forces. Putin made several warnings. We dismiss them even with greater contempt than we dismissed his warning in Berlin in 2007. He said recently that they are not only modernizing their strategic nuclear forces, but while Russia is seeking peace, if the world does not allow Russia to have its place and would stop at nothing to destroy Russia, well, Putin said, and I'm quoting him literally, he said, I am the Russian leader. And if it would come to that kind of situation, which we obviously don't want, well, maybe, then we don't need that kind of a world. That was an open threat, that if Russia would have to face a real challenge to its survival, they would stop it. Nothing, they would stop it. He recently said, when he was asked about Ukraine and what would happen if President Poroshenko would undertake a major military offensive. The response, as I assume, Kurt, you know that, he said, well, I hope he would not do it, because that would be a fundamental threat to Ukrainian statehood. A fundamental threat to Ukrainian statehood. There was no doubt in my mind that what he was trying to say, if they would do it, Russia would find a way not just to deal with a local offensive, but there can be very severe consequences. Was Putin bluffing? I'm sure he was. Was it an empty bluff? Well, I would not be so sure. One reason I'm so interested in looking for an opportunity to stabilize the relationship with Russia is because the stakes are truly enormous. Because I do not believe that we have enormous interests in how exactly Ukraine would join NATO, provided we maintain the right of Ukraine to join NATO. But it's not essential, as far as I'm concerned, for the survival of this republic, whether it would happen in 10 or 15 years, and how exactly we would be able to do it. But we're having a resurgent angry Russia, particularly allied with China, I think it may be an existential threat to the United States. And we would be reckless not to take it seriously. Let me be clear, I'm not talking about surrender. The reason I support Trump's call for greater military spending, for addressing numerous NATO deficiencies, is precisely because we need to negotiate with Russia only from a position of strength. But we also need to negotiate seriously, not just making noises, and not just telling that because of our superiority, both military and moral, we would just tell them, baby, that is the way it is, and they would have to accept it or else. I'm not sure that that would work.
Molly. There's a microphone coming.
Molly Hemingway with the Federalist. Thank you for your remarks. I was struck, Ambassador Volker, you say the good news is the Trump administration is basically continuing with what previous administrations have said needs to happen at NATO. Ambassador Burt, you said the bad news is that people are freaking out and they're disgusted. What if those are flipped, actually? Or what if you actually do want changes at NATO instead of just rhetoric of, you guys need to spend more money, you guys need to take care of your own defense? If you actually believe what people were saying for the previous 7 administrations, that that was important, you don't see much change happening, those things might not be good and bad, but bad and good. My question is, what can the U.S. do to actually affect change as opposed to just talk about it over and over? And does it require something like us actually pulling out or decreasing our own investment? Or what are the options that we have, the reasonable options?
Well, I think ironically we may be at the cusp of changes like this because of the erosion that is taking place within the alliance, and it is set off or triggered not necessarily an American-led restructuring of the alliance. It could set off a European effort to become more independent from the United States, or at least have a little more autonomy in terms of their defense efforts. And that's happening now within Europe. There is an EU initiative known as PESCO, and the Germans and the French, which is usually the case, are leading it. I think there's always a debate in Washington, there has been for the last 20, 25 years, should the U.S. oppose these sort of European efforts to strengthen the European pillar, or should they sort of take the position, no, this should happen only within NATO and with the U.S. at the table. I think with Trump we may see how far this sort of burden sharing within the NATO framework can go, and we may see, another, not necessarily a Trump administration, but a future U.S. administration, saying that the Europeans just aren't prepared to do enough. We've got to reconsider our position. We need to think about withdrawing forces from Europe. What I'm saying is that might lead the European concern either about American erratic policy or U.S. withdrawal, or a combination of the two, could lead the Europeans to themselves to take a more serious look at not the end of the Western alliance, but certainly a different Western alliance with two different pillars, two real pillars, where there was cooperation in some cases, and on other cases they would go their own way.
Kurt? Just a couple of thoughts. I think one of the things that's important to remember when talking about these issues being, should the U.S. pull out, is that NATO actually is a benefit to the United States. So if we were to pull out from that, we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot, which would not be a good policy.
Think more like draw down as opposed to pull out. There's not enough incentive.
No, it's like troop levels. They should be determined by perception of what the threats are and what the needs are to create deterrence. So, which we've actually been increasing because we've seen what the increase on Russian positioning and exercising has been. So no, I wouldn't say that. What I think you do see though is that Trump has made, while the policies are aimed at the same things, the fact that he is rattling cages as much as he is probably producing more results, which is exactly the opposite of what Germans want to think, but it's actually true. is that people do feel some compulsion. Okay, we better do something about defense spending. We better get more on track than we were, or we don't know what's going to happen here. So I think he is actually getting more out of that, even though it's the same set of policies. If I can just circle back to one thing about 2007, I think it's important to remember the context of what U.S. policy was at the time. The U.S. had a strategic dialogue with Russia. We were trying to work together across a range of issues. Very much, it was Bush and Putin with then subordinates having different working groups that were doing different things. A repackaging of what had been return of year decommission. The presidents had met several times. We were working together both bilaterally and also at NATO on things like missile defense, theater missile defense, common shared assessment, peacekeeping, some research and development. There was a lot of stuff going on. And it was in that context that Putin gave this speech, which was a shock to everybody in Russia, because we thought we were working pretty well with Russia. We actually had a lot of things going on. And there wasn't a rapid movement towards further NATO enlargement for Ukraine or Georgia. The issue in 2007 was Balkans. It was Albania, Croatia, whether Macedonia makes it or not. And we wanted to keep the doors open, but no one at that time was arguing for membership for Georgia or Ukraine or whether they were anywhere near ready. And so it did come a bit out of the blue, and I think it is more important to see that as Putin taking an initiative in some ways rather than response. And that gets to the present day, where I think we're making a mistake if we sort of give too much credence to the idea that Russia feels threatened. Nobody's threatening Russia. I mean, the Baltic states don't threaten Russia. The U.S. is not threatening Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia, and no one has troops on Russian territory. No one is occupying Russia or claiming to annex their territory. It's all the other way around. And so we need, Russia's not happy. Russia has grievances against its neighbors and thinks it has a right to determine their futures. So we need to push back on that. But I don't think we should go so far as to think that, well, we're threatening Russia and somehow we should be giving them things to accommodate that.
Well, 2 points. First, I assume nobody at this table wants to go as far as to give Russia things to accommodate them, to deal with their grievances, real and imagined. Having said that, we all remember, most of us remember what great late Big Brzezinski used to say, that without Ukraine, Russia cannot be an empire. It's true. But many Russians, particularly almost everybody in the Russian establishment, believe that with Ukraine in NATO, Russia can never be secure. And there is a particular sense that Ukraine is a nation, if you wish, built on its animosity toward Russia. That Ukraine includes different ethnic groups, different languages, different religions, was a part of different empires, and what unites that state is animosity toward Russia. If that country with almost 50 million people becomes an important part of NATO, there is a sense in Moscow it will be very difficult for them to be secure. And there would be a very strong sense to prevent it, unless Ukraine joining NATO happens in a carefully negotiated fashion, which I know Kurt is trying to do. The second point is about restructuring of NATO and what just happened in Brussels. I think that Trump is coming to Helsinki as a result of that in a stronger position, because there was an illusion in Moscow till very recently that hostility to Russia is really coming from Washington, and actually it is American hegemonic power. This is that power that is forcing reluctant Europeans to take anti-Russian positions. Now they can see that this is very, very simplistic. And Trump is entitled to say, I'm the only one in the West you really can deal with. You know that your friends, the Europeans, that they actually want to proceed with more sanctions. They really don't trust you. They consider you aggressive. And if you want to cut any kind of deals, I am the right man to deal with. I think it gives the president more leverage in talking to Putin in Helsinki.
I'm Barry Blackman from the Stimson Center. I'm looking forward to the Helsinki summit because just as Singapore ended the North Korean threat, I'm sure the Russian threat, nuclear threat, will go away after Helsinki. But I do have a serious point, and it's really an enlargement of points Rick has been making. Because the cohesion of the alliance depends on a lot more than what's said at NATO summits and whether there's increased spending or more. It depends on the broader relationship among the countries. And look what the administration is doing. It's undermining European goals on climate change, on the Iran agreement, and now we have the beginnings of a trade war. I mean, what's going to happen if the threat to put tariffs on European imports to the U.S. is fulfilled? What effect does that have on the relationships among the governments and therefore on the alliance? I think the situation is a lot more serious. And these personal attacks on individual leaders, I mean, I don't move in the same circles as some of you do, but I go to Europe quite often, and there's a lot of unhappiness there. Say that.
Well, I agree with you, Barry, and this is where, again, I think I disagree a little bit with Kurt. I think he's right in the sense that Trump's, for instance, his focus on burden sharing and getting Europeans to spend more, I think that has, in the short term, sort of forced some hands on some governments. They've gotten a little bit rattled. They feel they don't want to get singled out. It's sort of like a corporate CEO in the U.S. isn't going to do something because they're afraid they're going to end up in a Trump tweet. Some of these leaders are afraid they're going to get singled out and embarrassed unless they're really calm and collected like Mrs. Merkel. But I agree with you. In the long run, this kind of leadership is going to be very, very corrosive, particularly when put in that broader context of this, as Jacob pointed out, in terms of whether it's trade policy, environmental policy, non-proliferation policy. I mean, all the sort of major elements of a common Western strategy. So I am just as worried as you are that there is a process of unraveling going on. Now, what I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows at this point, is, you know, how long is this? How long will this take? I saw somebody quoted this week in the NATO summit, some European diplomat or someone quoted saying, "Well, we can make it maybe for 4 years under this administration, but if it's 8, it's all over."
Any final? Well, I think with that, we started early, so we will end early. Thank you.